They kicked her out of the store like a beggar, but they didn't know. The man waiting for her outside could wipe out this entire city with a single phone call. This is the story of a woman despised by the world, and the day she decided to stop being silent. If you enjoy stories of revenge, love, and power, watch until the end. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Start now. The rain started somewhere around 6 in the morning and hadn't quit since. By the time Selene Vale stepped off the number 9 bus on Kellerman Avenue, the sidewalk had turned into a shallow river, and her worn canvas sneakers were soaked through to the skin before she even reached the corner. She didn't complain about it. She never did. She stood at the intersection for a moment, her secondhand cardigan pulled tight across her chest, her dark hair plastered against her cheekbones from the half-block she'd already walked without an umbrella. Across the street, behind a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass and a brushed gold sign that caught the gray morning light, sat L'Etoile Bridal House, the most exclusive bridal boutique in the state of Connecticut. Selene took a breath, let it out slow. She could have called ahead. She could have sent the car, Lucien's car, the kind with tinted windows and a driver who never asked questions. She could have dropped his name the second she walked through the door and watched every single person in that building fall over themselves to be useful. She knew exactly what that looked like. She'd seen it happen. The way rooms shifted when people understood who Lucien Moretti was. The way voices dropped half a register. The way smiles became nervous and precise. She didn't want that. Not for this. The wedding dress was supposed to be hers, not his, not the Empire's. Just hers. The one thing in the entire orbit of her life that belonged to the woman she was before any of this, before the armored SUVs and the men with cold eyes standing at every entrance and the weight of a name she hadn't been born with pressing against her chest like a stone. So she'd come alone, told Lucien she was going to look at a fabric shop. He'd believed her, or he'd pretended to. With Lucien, it was sometimes impossible to tell the difference. She crossed the street and pushed through the door. The inside of L'Etoile was the kind of beautiful that was designed to make certain people feel like they didn't belong. Selene registered it immediately. The way the white marble floors gleamed without a single scuff. The way the gowns hung on their individual pedestals like religious artifacts behind velvet ropes. The soft orchestral music piped through speakers hidden in the crown molding. The air smelled like gardenias and money. 3 women in tailored black dresses moved through the space with the careful grace of people who had been hired not just to sell wedding gowns, but to curate an experience for a specific kind of customer. Selene was not that kind of customer. She knew it. They knew it inside of 30 seconds. The closest attendant, young, blonde, wearing heels that added 3 inches she didn't need, looked up from the appointment desk and did the thing that Selene had learned to recognize over the years. The eyes moved, fast. Down, up. A full assessment that lasted maybe 2 seconds and communicated everything without a word being spoken. Worn sneakers, thrift store cardigan. No jewelry except a thin silver ring on her right hand. Hair damp from rain. No visible designer anything. No companion. No appointment confirmation pulled up on a phone with a cracked screen and a case that cost more than most people's rent. Just a woman who looked like she'd taken the bus. "Do you have an appointment?" the attendant said. Her voice was professionally neutral, which was its own kind of dismissal. "I don't," Selene said. "I was hoping someone might be available to show me a few styles. I'm getting married in the spring." The attendant's expression didn't change. "We typically require consultations to be booked 4 to 6 weeks in advance. Walk-ins are... We don't usually accommodate walk-ins." "I understand. I can wait. If there's any availability." A pause. Another look. "Our pieces start at $14,000, just so you're aware." Selene held the woman's gaze. "I'm aware." The attendant picked up a tablet, tapped at it for a moment, and then seemed to make a decision that didn't involve anything on the screen. "I'll let you look around while I check with our floor manager." She disappeared through a door that blended seamlessly into the back wall, and Selene stood alone in the middle of the boutique and breathed through her nose and reminded herself why she was here and not somewhere easier. She moved toward the nearest gown. It was extraordinary. Ivory silk crepe with a structured bodice and a train that pooled across the pedestal platform in a way that looked effortless, but almost certainly required someone to arrange it for an hour. She reached out and touched the fabric at the hem, just lightly, felt the weight of it. "Please don't touch that," The voice came from behind her. Different voice. Older. Fuller. Carrying the particular frequency of someone who had spent years speaking to people in a specific way and had never once been told to stop. Selene turned. The woman standing 10 feet away was somewhere in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe knot at the base of her skull, and a cream blazer that was probably worth more than Selene's monthly rent had been when she was 20 and living in a studio apartment in the warehouse district. She had the kind of face that had been beautiful once and had curdled slightly into something harder. Not ugly, just stripped of softness, like marble that had been polished too many times. This was Vivian Croft. Selene didn't know her name yet, but she would later. She would know it the way you remember the face of someone who leaves a bruise. "I apologize," Selene said, pulling her hand back. "These are couture pieces," Vivian said. "They're not display items at a department store. The oils from human hands," she paused, letting the implication settle, "can damage the fabric permanently." "I understand. I'll be more careful." Vivian's eyes did the same calculation the attendants had done, but where the younger woman had been clinical about it, Vivian wore her conclusion openly. She tilted her head a fraction of an inch, which communicated more contempt than most people managed with a full sentence. "My associate tells me you came in without an appointment." "That's right." "And that you're looking for something." The slight pause before looking did something specific to the sentence. "A wedding gown," Selene said. "I'm getting married in the spring." Vivian folded her hands in front of her waist. The gesture was elegant. Everything about her was elegant in the way that a trap is elegant. Precise, clean, designed to close around something. "I see. And what kind of, budget are you working with?" Behind Vivian, near the far display cases, two other customers had looked up. A mother and daughter, both in expensively simple clothes, watching with the particular attention of people who had sensed that something more interesting than wedding dresses was about to happen. Selene felt the weight of that. The awareness of being watched, assessed, placed. She named a number. It was a real number, a number she had saved carefully over 18 months of working 3 jobs before her life had changed in ways she still sometimes couldn't fully understand. It wasn't the number she could have named. It wasn't even close to the number she could have named if she'd wanted to reach into the account that had her name on it alongside Lucien's. But it was her number, her money, her choice. Vivian smiled. It was the worst kind of smile, the kind that arrives fully formed on someone's face without touching anything behind it. Well, she turned slightly as though including the entire boutique in the conversation. "We don't really have anything suitable at that level. Our pieces are investment pieces. For brides who are prepared to invest in something meaningful." The mother near the display case had stopped pretending to look at veils. Her daughter had her phone out. Selene registered all of it in her peripheral vision and kept her face still. "I understand your pieces are high-end," she said. "I was hoping you might have something more accessible in your collection, or perhaps samples." Samples. Vivian repeated the word like it had a bad taste. "We don't do samples. This isn't that kind of establishment." She let her gaze travel down Selene's frame one more time, unhurried, deliberate. "I think you might be more comfortable somewhere on Brennan Street. There are several retailers there that cater to—" Another pause, another smile. More diverse price points. Selene's jaw tightened, just slightly. She worked to keep her breathing even. "I'd like to make an appointment," she said, "for a proper consultation at your earliest available date." "I don't think we'll be able to help you." Vivian's voice had dropped the performance of courtesy. It was cleaner now, more honest, more ugly. "We have a waiting list of brides we're already committed to, and our team's time it's valuable. It wouldn't be fair to them to take on clients who aren't aligned with what we offer." The daughter near the display case was definitely filming now. Selene could see the phone angle. She should have left. She knew in the part of her brain that had been sharpened by years of surviving in spaces where she wasn't wanted that the cleanest move was to turn around and walk out with her spine straight and let the door close quietly behind her. She'd done it before, in worse places, for worse reasons. But something had locked in her chest in the last 30 seconds. Some knot that had been tightening and tightening since she'd stepped off the bus and felt the cold water fill her shoes and stood on the corner and looked at the gold sign and reminded herself she deserved to be here. She had every right to be here. She was going to walk through that door like anyone else and be treated like anyone else. "I'm simply asking for an appointment," Selene said. Her voice was level. "I'm not asking for anything I'm not willing to pay for." Vivian turned toward the back of the boutique. "Marcus." A man in a dark blazer materialized from the vicinity of the storage area with the readiness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this cue. Large, expressionless, the kind of broad that filled a doorway. "Marcus is going to show you out," Vivian said. "I do hope you find what you're looking for at an appropriate establishment." There was a small sound from the direction of the display cases. The mother had said something quiet to her daughter. A small, mean laugh, short and swallowed but not swallowed enough. Selene turned toward the door on her own before Marcus reached her because she had enough dignity left to not be physically guided, and she almost made it. Marcus's hand closed around her upper arm. Not brutally, not the way it would have looked on a dark street, just firmly. The grip of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much force to use and understood that the absence of brutality didn't make the gesture any less of what it was. He steered her toward the door and pushed it open, and the cold rain hit her face again, and she was outside on the wet sidewalk with the gold lettering of L'Étoile Bridal house behind her, and the gray sky above her, and the sound of a city that didn't care about any of this going on in every direction. She stood still. Her arm hurt where he'd gripped it. Not badly. Just enough to be real. Just enough to make it something she couldn't think her way around. She hadn't cried. She wasn't going to cry. But something was happening in her chest that felt worse than crying. A kind of cold, clarifying anger that arrived not with heat, but with terrible stillness. She heard the door of the boutique open again behind her. She turned, expecting Marcus, expecting Vivian, expecting more of whatever this was. It was Nadia. Nadia Cross had been standing just inside the boutique for the last 10 minutes. Selene hadn't seen her come in, hadn't known she was there. Nadia, her oldest friend, the woman who had been at her side for 7 years, who had held her hand when her mother died and talked her down from a dozen bad nights, and sat across from her in 1,000 different coffee shops while the world moved around them. Nadia was looking at her with large, soft eyes that were full of something that looked exactly like compassion. "Oh my God, Sel." She stepped forward and put her arms around Selene's shoulders. "I saw the whole thing. That woman was absolutely horrible. Are you okay?" Selene let herself be held for a moment. Felt Nadia's familiar warmth, the smell of her perfume, the specific comfort of someone who knew you before you became whoever you were now. "I'm okay," Selene said. She had no right to do that. None. You should report her. You should call someone. "I'm fine." "You're shaking." Selene pulled back, looked at Nadia's face. "What are you doing here?" Nadia blinked. "What?" "This boutique. Why are you at this boutique right now, Nadia?" A half-second pause. Nearly invisible. If you didn't know her, if you hadn't spent 7 years learning the small geography of her expressions, you would have missed it entirely. "I was in the neighborhood," Nadia said. "I was picking up dry cleaning on Kellerman, and I saw you through the window, and you saw me through the window. I was worried about you. You looked, it's fine." Selene turned away, looked up the street. The rain was thinning slightly. The city moved on around her in both directions. She didn't think about the pause. She filed it somewhere and didn't think about it. Not yet. What she thought about was the grip on her arm, and the sound of that small, mean laugh, and the way Vivian Croft had looked at her clothes and decided in 2 seconds what she was worth. She reached into her cardigan pocket for her phone, turned it over in her palm, didn't dial. She'd promised herself this would be untouched by Lucien's world. Just this one thing. She put the phone back. "Come on," Nadia said, sliding her arm through Selene's. "Let me buy you coffee. There's that place on Harwick that does the brown sugar oat latte you like." Selene walked with her, because the alternative was standing on a wet sidewalk in front of a boutique that had just thrown her out, and she was cold, and her feet were soaked, and the arm that Marcus had grabbed was starting to ache in a way that felt like a bruise forming. And some days you just walk where someone leads you because you don't have anything better to do with the direction. They sat in the coffee shop for 45 minutes. Nadia talked. She was good at talking. Always had been, filling silences with warmth and movement and the small dramas of her week. Selene listened and nodded and held her cup in both hands and felt the heat from it and watched Nadia's face and thought about nothing in particular. She texted Lucien from under the table while Nadia described a problem with her landlord. Fine. Finished early. On my way back. 3 minutes later, don't stop anywhere else in this rain, sending the car. She didn't argue. The car arrived 12 minutes after that. Black, armored, with tinted windows and a driver named Carver, who opened the door without a word and closed it behind her without a word, and pulled into traffic with the smooth efficiency of a man who had been doing this for a long time. Nadia hugged her goodbye on the sidewalk and waved at the car and said she'd call her tomorrow. Selene watched her through the window until the car turned a corner. Then she sat back in the seat and looked at the city sliding past, and put her fingers carefully around the place on her arm where the grip had been and felt the tenderness of it, and didn't look away from what that meant. She'd known before today that the world sorted people. She'd grown up with that knowledge the way you grow up knowing about weather. Not as an abstraction, but as something that got into your clothes and your skin and affected what was possible on any given day. She'd been sorted her whole life. Too poor for this neighborhood, wrong school for that opportunity, wrong last name, wrong zip code, wrong kind of clothes. But there was something different about today, something that sat lower and colder than the usual humiliation. Because she'd gone in there alone. She'd made that choice deliberately, specifically, with intention. I want this to be mine, untouched. And what the morning had proven, with Marcus's hand on her arm and the sound of that laugh and the rain on her wet face, was that without the name, without the convoy, without the weight of what Lucien Moretti meant in this city, she was invisible, disposable, easy. The woman Lucien loved was powerless without Lucien. She sat with that for the rest of the drive. The Moretti estate sat 30 minutes outside the city proper, set back from a private road behind iron gates and surrounded by trees that were old enough to be indifferent to whatever happened in the world beyond them. From the outside, it looked like old money. From the inside, it was something more complicated, beautiful and cold and organized around the assumption that threat was always somewhere nearby, which meant the beauty had an edge to it, the way a museum has an edge because everything is pristine and nothing is supposed to be touched. Lucien was waiting in the front hall. This was unusual enough that Selene registered it as she came through the door. He rarely waited, not because he didn't care, but because he was almost always somewhere else, dealing with something that required his attention, and the estate functioned in his absence with the precision of a machine that had been running a long time. He was standing with his phone in his hand, and he was looking at her in a way that was very still. Lucien Moretti at rest looked like a painting of something dangerous. He was 38 and had the kind of face that had been shaped by years of watching everything and showing very little. Sharp features, dark eyes that processed information the way cameras process light, a jaw that held tension like a muscle that never fully unclenched. He was in a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, which was as casual as he usually got, and he was looking at her arm. "What happened to your arm?" he said. Not a question. Selene pulled her sleeve down. "Nothing. I'm fine. Carver called me when he picked you up." Lucien walked toward her slowly. Not aggressively, just with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned a long time ago that hurrying communicated a kind of disorder he didn't allow himself. "He said you were at L'Etoile Bridal on Kellerman." He stopped in front of her. "You said you were going to a fabric shop." "I lied," Selene said flatly. "I wanted to look at wedding dresses without... I wanted to do it myself." He looked at her arm again, then at her face. "Who touched you?" The two words carried almost no inflection, which made them worse. There was a specific quality to Lucien's voice when something had already been decided. A flatness, an absence of uncertainty, like a door that had already been shut and locked from the inside. A security guard. He grabbed my arm to move me toward the door. She met his eyes. "They threw me out, Lucien, in front of customers. The owner stood there and..." She stopped, felt something tighten in her throat. She hated it. She hated the tightening. "She told me I wasn't the right kind of customer. Then she had security remove me." Silence. Lucien's face didn't move. It had the particular quality of stillness that Selene had learned over the past 2 years to find more frightening than shouting. Shouting meant someone had lost control. This stillness meant someone had simply decided. He reached out and very carefully pushed her sleeve up and looked at the marks on her arm. Fingerprint bruises, just beginning to color. Nothing serious, the kind of thing that would fade in 3 days. He looked at them for a long moment, then he lowered her sleeve gently, which was somehow the most frightening thing he'd done since she walked in. "Go upstairs," he said. "Get dry. I'll have the kitchen send something up." "Lucien, go upstairs, Selene." She went. Not because she was afraid of him. She'd stopped being afraid of him in the traditional sense sometime in the first year, when she'd understood that the thing he would do to anyone who hurt her would never, under any circumstances, be turned toward her. What she felt now was something more complicated. The uneasy knowledge of being on the protected side of something that destroyed without remorse. She changed into dry clothes, sat at the window and watched the rain, ate the food that arrived on a tray without tasting it. 40 minutes after she'd come upstairs, she could hear something different in the way the house moved. Not louder, if anything, quieter, but a different quality of quiet. The kind that happens when the people who maintain a space suddenly become very focused on maintaining it perfectly because the person at the center of it has made a decision. She didn't go back down. Not yet. She sat with the rain and the gray light and the fading ache in her arm, and she thought about Nadia's face at the boutique door. The warmth of her expression, the speed of her arrival, the half-second pause before I was in the neighborhood. She reached for her phone and looked at it for a long time without dialing. Then she set it face down on the windowsill and watched the trees bend in the wind outside and listened to the sounds of a house reorganizing itself around the direction of a man's fury. And she understood, with a cold clarity that felt like growing up, though she was already 24 and had grown up 100 times before, that the world she had been trying to keep separate from her dress, from her choice, from her one small act of independence, had followed her through the boutique door the moment she walked in. There was no part of her life that Lucien's world hadn't already touched. The question, the one she hadn't found an answer to yet, sitting in the gray light with the rain against the glass, was whether that was something to mourn or something to learn to use. Her phone buzzed, a single text, from a number she didn't recognize. "You should ask your friend why she was really at the boutique today." She stared at it. Then she looked up at her own reflection in the rain-dark window. The woman looking back at her had wet eyes but a still face. Downstairs, she heard the distant, low sound of Lucien's voice on a phone call. Precise, unhurried, final. Bad. Selene read the text 3 times. Each time, the words stayed exactly the same. "You should ask your friend why she was really at the boutique today." No name, no context, just that sentence sitting in her phone like a splinter under the skin. Small enough to ignore, painful enough that you couldn't stop pressing on it. She set the phone down, picked it up again, looked at the number. It was a local area code, but nothing she recognized. No contact match, no history. She typed back a single question mark and sent it, and watched the screen for 2 minutes and got nothing back. Downstairs, Lucien was still on the phone. She could hear the cadence of his voice through the floor. Not the words, just the rhythm. Controlled, low. The specific frequency of a man delivering instructions that he expected to be followed without discussion. She didn't go down. Instead, she sat at the window with the phone in her lap and thought about Nadia's face. The warmth in it, the speed of it. How quickly Nadia had appeared at that boutique door with her arms open and her eyes full of something that had looked, at the time, like the exact right kind of concern. The thing about Nadia Cross was that she was a good performer. Selene had always known this, had admired it even, in the abstract way you admire a skill without examining what it might be used for. Nadia was warm and vivid, and she filled rooms the way certain people do, pulling attention toward herself not through aggression, but through a kind of radiant need to be seen that most people found charming because they didn't look at it long enough to understand what it cost. Selene had looked at it for 7 years. She knew the difference, now that she was sitting in the gray light turning it over, between Nadia surprised and Nadia performing surprise. Between Nadia concerned and Nadia wearing concern like a coat she'd put on for the occasion. At the boutique door, after Marcus had put Selene on the wet sidewalk, Nadia had appeared in seconds, had already been stepping through the door, arms already open, voice already at the right pitch. "Oh my God, Sel!" Selene pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose and closed her eyes. The dry cleaning story. The neighborhood. The window. She'd filed it and not thought about it. Now she thought about it and the filing felt naive. The kind of thing you do when you want something to be innocent more than you want to know if it is. She heard Lucien's call end, heard his footsteps on the stairs, unhurried even. The pace of a man who had already done whatever needed to be done and was now moving through the rest of the evening at his own speed. He knocked once on the bedroom door, which he always did, even though it was his bedroom in his house. That detail had disarmed her in the beginning. She'd told him once, and he'd looked at her like he didn't understand why it was notable. "Come in," she said. He came in and closed the door behind him and looked at her sitting at the window with her phone in her lap. And he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed facing her, close enough that she could see the faint tension in his jaw that hadn't fully released yet. "Tell me everything that happened," he said, "from when you arrived." "Lucien, everything, Selene, not the version where you protect my feelings about it. The whole thing." She told him. She was precise about it. The attendant's look, Vivian's slow assessment, the word samples, and the pause before it, the customers watching, the daughter filming. She kept her voice level. She told him about Marcus's hand on her arm and the sound of the laugh from the display cases. She watched his face while she talked, and his face didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. A quality of attention that sharpened in increments, the way light sharpens right before something burns. When she was done, he sat with it for a moment. "The owner's name," he said. "I don't know it." "Vivian Croft." He said it without hesitation, which meant he'd already known before she finished the story. He'd already made the calls. "She owns the building on Kellerman outright, 2 other properties in the state. She banks through Fairmont First Trust and carries insurance through a Whitmore subsidiary." He paused. "She has a daughter getting married in the fall, at Sinclair Gardens." Selene looked at him. "You did all that in 40 minutes. Less." She didn't ask what he'd done with the information. She understood, with the particular clarity that came from 2 years of watching how Lucien operated, that the doing had already been set in motion, and asking for the specifics was like asking for the mechanics of weather. It was happening whether you understood it or not. What she said instead was, "I got a text." She held the phone out to him. He took it and read the message and looked at the number for a long moment and then handed the phone back. "Who sent it?" she asked. "I don't know yet." "But you'll find out?" "Yes." She turned the phone over in her palm. "Lucien, was Nadia at that boutique on purpose?" The pause was very short. In anyone else, it would have been undetectable. In Lucien, who never paused unless he was choosing a word with surgical precision, it was a full answer before he spoke. "I don't know," he said. "That's not a no." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him. He looked back at her with those dark, flat, watchful eyes, and she understood that there was something he wasn't saying. Not lying, Lucien rarely lied outright, but withholding. Holding something in reserve with the careful restraint of a man who had decided she wasn't ready for it yet, or who needed more information before he delivered it, or who was trying, in his particular way, to protect her from a thing she was going to need to know. "Tell me," she said. "Not tonight." "Lucien." "Selene." His voice was still gentle. That was the thing about him that people didn't expect, the gentleness. The men who feared him assumed he was all sharpness, all the way down. But there was this quality in the way he spoke to her that was something else entirely, something careful and deliberate and particular to her. "I need to confirm something before I say it. Tonight, I need you to let it sit." She wanted to push. She felt the urge in her chest like a physical pressure. But she'd also learned over 2 years that Lucien Moretti did not withhold information to be cruel. He withheld it because he had genuinely calculated that the timing mattered, and he had never yet been wrong about the timing. "Okay," she said. "One night." He nodded. Then he reached out and touched her face. Just 2 fingers against her cheekbone, brief and deliberate. Then he stood and moved toward the door. "Get some sleep," he said. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain finally stop somewhere around 2 in the morning, and she thought about Nadia in coffee shops, in hospital waiting rooms, on the phone at midnight. She thought about the specific texture of that friendship, the way it had always had a slight edge to it that she'd chosen to interpret as intensity rather than something less comfortable. the way Nadia's warmth ran hottest when things were worst for Selene. The way she had absorbed every detail of Selene's life with Lucien over the past 2 years with an attention that had felt like care. What if it wasn't care? What if it was inventory? She fell asleep around 3 with that thought sitting behind her ribs like a stone. The next morning was clear and cold and bright the way mornings sometimes are after heavy rain. The sky washed out to a pale, precise blue, the light sharp and unforgiving on every surface. Selene came downstairs at 8 to find that Lucien had already been awake for hours. This was normal. He ran on less sleep than anyone she'd ever met, a trait she suspected had less to do with biology and more to do with the fact that sleeping required a certain surrender to unconsciousness that a man in his position had trained himself out of over many years. He was at the kitchen table with a tablet and a coffee, and Renata, who was his most senior operations coordinator, a small, precise woman in her late 40s who looked like a reference librarian and communicated with the efficient brevity of someone who had been in rooms where extra words cost lives. Renata looked up when Selene entered and gave a brief, neutral nod. "Give me 5 minutes," Lucien said. Selene poured coffee and sat at the far end of the table and looked at the garden through the windows and listened to them talk in the half-coded shorthand of people who'd worked together long enough to strip language down to its load-bearing elements. Accounts. Timing. A name. Vivian Croft. Spoken by Renata without inflection. A list of things that were being paused, redirected, terminated. Selene drank her coffee and looked at the garden and didn't pretend she couldn't hear. After 5 minutes, Renata left. Lucien came to the other end of the table with his tablet and sat down across from her and looked at her for a moment the way he sometimes did. An assessment, not unkind, just thorough, reading the quality of her morning the way other people read weather. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept." "For about 2 hours." She didn't argue. "What did you confirm?" He set the tablet down, laced his hands together on the table. This was a tell she'd learned, the specific gesture of a man preparing to say something he would rather not say. "Nadia Cross has been in contact with a member of my organization for approximately 7 months," he said, "passing information about your habits, your schedule, what you've shared with her about," a brief pause, "our life." The coffee cup was still in Selene's hands. She was aware of this because she was aware suddenly of the effort it was taking to keep holding it rather than setting it down. She set it down. "What kind of information?" she said. "Personal things, where you went, what upset you, what you'd said to her about wanting the wedding separate from my—" He stopped. "She told someone you planned to go to a boutique alone, before you went." Selena's face did something she couldn't stop. It was brief, a tightening around the eyes and mouth that happened before she could arrange her expression into something more controlled. Then it was gone. "She told someone you were going to L'Etoile specifically," Lucien continued, 2 days ago. "So she was there because someone told her to be there, to watch, to report back on how you handled it." He held her gaze. "I don't know yet if she knew what Vivian Croft would do. I don't know if she specifically arranged the humiliation or if she was simply positioned to observe it. I'm still working on which." Selene was quiet for a long moment. The garden outside was very bright. A bird landed on the edge of the stone fountain near the far wall and sat there for a moment looking at the water. 7 months, she said. "Yes." "Who in your organization?" Lucien's jaw tightened very slightly. "A man named Soto. He's been handled." She didn't ask what handled meant. "Why?" she said. "Why would Nadia—" "I think," Lucien said carefully, "that you already know the answer to that." She did. She'd known it for years in the way you know things you've decided not to examine. She and Nadia had been friends since they were 17, 2 girls from the same neighborhood with the same limited options and the same determination to want more than the circumstances they'd been handed, but where Selene had eventually found her way to something that looked, from the outside, like a different life. Even if that life was complicated and dangerous and not what she'd imagined when she was 17, Nadia had stayed in the same orbit, same apartment, same jobs, same wanting. And somewhere in the past 2 years, that wanting had curdled into something that had a different name. "She wanted this to be mine," Selene said. Not to Lucien, just out loud. She thought She thought I'd taken something from her, that I'd been in the right place at the right time and gotten something that should have been. She stopped. She thought if you saw me weak enough, you'd... Yes, Lucien said. The simplicity of that confirmation was worse than any elaboration would have been. Selene pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Not to stop from crying. She wasn't going to cry. She'd made that decision at some point in the night without consciously making it, but to give herself 3 seconds of physical sensation to anchor against. I want to talk to her, she said. Selene, not you, not Renata, not... She gestured vaguely at the understood machinery of his world. Me. I want to sit across from her and I want her to say it to my face. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. That's not how I'd handle it. I know, but it's how I'm going to handle it. Another long moment. He was measuring something. Her steadiness, her intention, whether what she wanted was going to make things better or worse. She sat still under the measurement and let him take his time. Okay, he said finally. What? She called Nadia at 10 o'clock, asked if she could meet that afternoon. Nadia said yes immediately, with a warmth in her voice that now had a different texture. Not comforting, but navigated. The particular register of someone who believed they were controlling a situation and hadn't yet understood that the situation had shifted underneath them. They met at a coffee shop on Renwick Street. Not the one Nadia had taken her to the day before. Somewhere neutral. Selene arrived first and chose a table near the back wall, facing the door, and ordered a black coffee and sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed through her mouth in a slow, even rhythm, and waited. Nadia came in 6 minutes later looking exactly like herself, bright-faced, her coat slightly damp from the cold outside, her eyes finding Selene immediately and warming in that way they always did. She crossed the room with her particular energy, that forward momentum that had always felt like enthusiasm and that Selene was now looking at with different eyes and understanding as something else, as velocity toward something she wanted. Hey! Nadia unwound her scarf and dropped into the chair across from Selene. I'm glad you called. I was worried about you after yesterday. How's the arm? Fine. You should have iced it. Did you ice it? Nadia. Something in Selene's voice landed. Not a warning, exactly. More like a frequency. A flatness that didn't belong to normal conversation, didn't have the texture of ordinary afternoon coffee between friends. Nadia heard it. Selene watched her hear it, watched a very small shift happen behind her eyes. Not fear, not yet, but a recalibration. The adjustment of someone who has been walking confidently toward a destination and has just noticed that the ground is different than expected. What's wrong? Nadia said. I need you to tell me why you were at the boutique yesterday. A pause. Shorter than the one the day before, because there was less time to construct a story, or because the story she'd prepared wasn't working in this register. I told you, I was in the neighborhood. You saw me through the window. Selene kept her voice even. The boutique is on Kellerman. Your dry cleaner is on Marsh Street. That's 11 blocks, Nadia. You'd have no reason to walk down Kellerman. The warmth in Nadia's face had developed a slight structural instability, still present, but working harder. I changed dry cleaners, she said. There's one on Kellerman now near the... Stop! The word landed clean and flat, and Nadia stopped. Selene looked at her, really looked at her, the way she'd been avoiding doing for 2 years, because looking carefully at the people you love most is the most dangerous thing you can do, because what you find there is sometimes irreversible. How long have you been talking to someone in Lucien's organization? Selene said. The warmth in Nadia's face finally collapsed. What replaced it wasn't guilt. Or not only guilt. It was something more complicated than that, a kind of raw, exposed quality, like a wound that had been bandaged for a long time and was suddenly in the open air. Who told you? She said. Not a denial, just, who told you? Selene felt the confirmation of that non-denial settle through her like cold water. Even though she'd known, even though she'd lain awake knowing, the absence of a denial still hit differently than expecting it to. How long? Selene said again. Nadia's jaw worked for a moment. Then, 7 months, give or take. And yesterday. I didn't... Nadia pressed her hands flat on the table, a gesture that mirrored Selene's without either of them noticing. I didn't set you up. I want to be clear about that. I knew you were going to L'Etoile because you mentioned it 2 weeks ago when you were talking about wanting to do the dress thing alone, and I—" She stopped. "I passed that on. I passed it on because that's what I'd been doing, passing things on. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't tell Vivian Croft to do anything." "But you watched," Selene said. "You stood inside that boutique and you watched a security guard grab my arm and drag me toward the door. And you let it happen, and then you came outside and you held me." Nadia's eyes had filled. The tears were real. Selene was certain of that, certain in the way you can be certain about something in a person you've known for 7 years. The pain behind the tears was real. That almost made it worse. "I know," Nadia said. Her voice had gone rough. "I know how that looks. I don't care how it looks. I care what it was. It was—" Nadia pulled a breath. The tears didn't fall. She held them back with a visible effort, the physical mechanics of a person trying to maintain some form of dignity in the middle of being taken apart. "I was angry. I've been angry for 2 years, Sel. Since you and Lucien. Since all of this happened. I know that makes me a terrible person. I know that. But I kept waiting for it to get less, and it didn't get less, and eventually you thought if you could show him I was weak. I thought if he saw you outside his world, he'd see that you don't belong there." Nadia's voice cracked on the last word. "That you never belong there. That neither of you belong together. I thought—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against her mouth, looked at the table. "I don't know what I thought. I thought it would even something out." Silence. The coffee shop moved around them. A couple at a table near the window laughed at something on a phone. The espresso machine ran. Ordinary afternoon, ordinary life, uninterested in the particular ruin happening in the back corner. Selene looked at Nadia's face. The tears still held back. The shame that was genuine. The grief that was also genuine. And underneath both of them, still visible if you knew where to look, the knot of something older and harder that had been there for years and that sorry wouldn't undo. She felt, very clearly, 2 things at once. A grief for something that was already over and something else. Something colder and more deliberate. Something new. She picked up her coffee cup, took a sip, set it down. "I'm not going to let Lucien destroy you," she said. Nadia looked up. "I'm not going to let him take you apart the way he's taking apart Vivian Croft right now. I want you to understand that's a choice I'm making, not something that's just happening. Do you understand the difference?" "Sel, your family's restaurant is in trouble." Selene watched Nadia's face confirm it without speaking. "It's been in trouble for 8 months. Your parents haven't told you how bad it is. It's bad." Nadia's expression had gone still, careful, like a person standing on ice that has become uncertain. "How do you know that?" she said. "Because I've known for 2 months and I've been deciding what to do about it. And now I've decided." Selene folded her hands around the cup. "I'm going to help them. Not because you deserve it, and not because we're okay. We're not okay, and I don't know if we will be, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm going to help them because they're good people who built something real, and they don't deserve to lose it because their daughter made bad choices." Nadia stared at her. The tears had finally broken through. Not dramatically, just a slow overflow that she didn't try to stop. "Why?" she said. "Because I'm not the person you thought I'd become," Selene said, "and I need to keep proving that to myself more than I need to prove it to you." She put money on the table for both coffees, pulled on her coat. "Don't contact me for a while," she said. "When I'm ready to talk again, I'll reach out. Don't try to move the timeline." She walked out of this coffee shop and onto Renwick Street into the cold, bright afternoon, and she walked half a block before she found a doorway and stepped into it and leaned against the wall and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and gave herself exactly 60 seconds. She counted them. At 60, she straightened, took a breath, started walking. By the time she reached the car, her face was completely still. 3 days later, L'Etoile Bridal House closed its doors, not with drama, with paperwork, with a series of logistical failures that arrived in sequence like carefully arranged dominoes. The luxury supplier for the Marceline collection cited a contractual dispute and suspended deliveries. The building's secondary lender, a firm Selene had never heard of and suspected didn't exist in any meaningful independent sense, called a clause, and demanded restructuring of the lease terms. 3 of Vivian Croft's 7 staff members resigned on the same morning, citing a more attractive opportunity which had materialized with suspicious convenience. By Thursday, the boutique's social media had gone quiet. By Friday, the gold sign on the window was dark. Selene found out from Renata, not from Lucien, who had stopped discussing it the way you stop discussing a thing once it's settled. Renata delivered the information with her characteristic lack of inflection over breakfast while Lucien was on a call in the other room, and Selene listened and nodded and felt something in her chest that she spent the rest of the morning trying to identify. It wasn't satisfaction. Or not only satisfaction, there was a layer underneath the satisfaction that she didn't like. Something that had recognized the destruction and found it deserved, found it clean, found it almost beautiful in its precision. That recognition unsettled her more than the destruction itself. She didn't say anything to Lucien about it. What she did instead was call a woman named Harper Quinn. She'd gotten the name from the footage on the daughter's phone, footage that had found its way to Renata through channels Selene didn't ask about. In the video, visible for about 4 seconds in the background of Vivian Croft's performance, was a young woman in a black staff dress who had watched the whole thing with an expression that didn't match her colleagues. Not the professional neutrality of the other attendants, not the small mean amusement of the customers. Something else. Discomfort. The specific misery of someone watching something wrong happen and being too scared of the consequences to do anything about it. Selene called the number she'd been given. Harper Quinn answered on the 3rd ring with the careful voice of someone who had been expecting either nothing or something very bad, and was braced for both. "Ms. Vale," she said, "you can call me Selene. I wanted to talk to you about a dress." She was standing in the garden the following Tuesday afternoon, watching the light change across the stone wall at the far end, when she heard the front gate and then the sound of a car she didn't recognize. She turned. Lucien was already coming through the back door, jacket off, moving with a purpose that was different from his usual pace. Not faster exactly, but tighter, more contained, like a man who was managing something very carefully. Behind him was Renata, and behind Renata was a man Selene didn't know. Older, weathered, with a face that had the flattened, unremarkable quality of someone who had spent years working to be unmemorable. "Inside," Lucien said to Selene. "Not urgent, but not optional." She followed them in and stood at the edge of the kitchen while Lucien and Renata and the unmemorable man spoke in the shorthand she'd learned to parse, and she assembled what she was hearing the way you assemble a picture from peripheral details when you're not allowed to look at it directly. A name she hadn't heard before. Orloff. A location, the estate, the road in. A timeline. Tonight, possibly. Tomorrow at the latest. She felt the cold begin at the back of her neck and move down her spine in a slow, clear line. Lucien turned to her. His face was doing the thing it did when he had already processed something and arrived at the far side of it and was now delivering the outcome. "We're going to have company tonight," he said, "the kind that doesn't knock." Selene looked at him. "How bad?" He held her gaze for a moment. The answer was in the moment before he spoke, in the quality of his stillness, in the way Renata had moved to stand between Selene and the door without appearing to do it deliberately. "Bad enough," he said, and then the lights went out. The lights came back on in 4 seconds. Emergency generators. Selene knew this because she'd asked about them once, early on, when she'd first started understanding what living inside the Moretti estate actually meant. And Lucien had explained the redundant power systems with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing indoor plumbing. The estate had 3 independent power sources, the main grid, a diesel backup, and something else she'd never fully understood the mechanics of. 4 seconds of absolute dark. In those 4 seconds, nobody moved. Selene stood at the edge of the kitchen and didn't breathe and listened to the house. What she heard was nothing. Not the nothing of a quiet building, but the nothing of a building that had suddenly become very alert, like the silence right before a large animal moves. When the lights returned, Lucien was already at the window. He stood sideways to the glass. She'd noticed him do this before, and had only recently understood it was habit, the instinct of a man who had internalized never presenting a full silhouette to an exterior window. He looked out at the garden with his hands loose at his sides and his face doing nothing at all. Renata was on her phone. The unmemorable man was gone. Selene hadn't seen him leave. "What was that?" she said. Power line on the north perimeter. Lucien didn't turn from the window. Could be weather, could be deliberate. Which do you think it is? He turned then, looked at her directly. I think you should go upstairs and pack a bag. 12 hours of clothes, essentials. Nothing else. Lucien. Selene. His voice was even, controlled. The kind of controlled that costs something to maintain. I need you to do that right now. Can you do that right now? She looked at his face, at the set of his jaw, the quality of his eyes. Not afraid, Lucien Moretti did not appear to be capable of conventional fear, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like calculation running very fast against a problem with no clean answer. Yes, she said. I can do that. She went upstairs. She packed the bag with the methodical efficiency of someone who had been quietly preparing for this possibility, even while refusing to fully acknowledge it. Toiletries, documents, the particular cardigan she slept in when she was cold and anxious, the small photograph of her mother she kept in the drawer of her nightstand. Her hands were steady. She noticed this and found it slightly alarming, the way the body sometimes disconnects from the reality of a situation and simply performs the functional task in front of it. She was back downstairs in 11 minutes. The house had changed in those 11 minutes. There were more people in it, men she recognized as part of the outer security team, moving through the rooms with a purposefulness that had no wasted motion. Someone had covered the main floor windows with interior shutters she hadn't known existed. The kitchen lights were off. The only illumination was the secondary system, lower wattage, casting everything in a slightly amber quality that made the rooms look like they belonged to a different building. Lucien was standing with 3 men near the front hall, talking quietly. He saw her come down the stairs and broke away. Car's in the lower garage, he said. Carver will take you to the Wren Street property. You know where that is. The apartment. Yes. You're not coming. Not yet. She looked at him. This was the thing about these moments. The terrible efficiency of them. The way they stripped everything down to function and logistics, and the blunt, practical language of people managing a dangerous situation, leaving no room for the things that actually mattered, the things you'd want to say if you thought you might not get another chance to say them. How long? She said. A few hours, possibly overnight. I'll call you. Lucien? She stepped closer to him, lowered her voice. Tell me what Orlov is. Tell me right now, not the version where you're protecting me from it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Mikhail Orlov runs a syndicate out of the northeastern ports. He and I have had an arrangement for 3 years that has stopped being an arrangement. He's been escalating for 2 months. Tonight may be the escalation point. Maybe? He said. Tonight is the escalation point. I've confirmed it in the last 20 minutes. She absorbed this. And you're staying here. I'm staying here because if I run, it signals something I can't afford to signal. Because this house is the ground I hold, and if I leave it under pressure, it's not my ground anymore. He said it without drama, just the flat logic of a man explaining a chess position. And because Orlov expects me to move the vulnerable people out and hunker down and wait, and I'm going to do exactly that, which means he'll be surprised by what happens next. What happens next? He almost smiled. It was the least comforting expression she had ever seen on a human face. Go to the apartment, Selene. He kissed her once. Brief, clean, precise, and turned back to his men. She went. The Wren Street apartment was on the 14th floor of a building that looked from the outside like an unremarkable piece of commercial architecture from the late 90s. Inside, the apartment was spare and functional and had the quality of a space that had been designed not for living in, but for waiting in. Clean lines, minimal furniture, windows that were high-quality glass she suspected was reinforced, a fully stocked kitchen, a secure phone line on the desk in the second bedroom. Carver brought her up and did a sweep of the apartment with the thoroughness of someone for whom thoroughness was a professional standard. Then he positioned himself in the hallway outside the door, and that was that. Selene set her bag down on the bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the city 14 floors below. She called Lucien at 11. He answered immediately and told her it was quiet and to sleep, and she said she would and didn't. She lay on the bed in the amber dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Orlov, about the North Perimeter power line, about the quality of Lucien's voice when he said tonight is the escalation point. Around 1 in the morning, her phone buzzed. Not a call, a text. from the same unknown number that had sent her the message about Nadia. "They're not here for Lucien." She sat up, typed back, "What?" The response came in less than 30 seconds. "The attack tonight. Orloff isn't targeting the estate, he's targeting you. He's been watching the estate for 6 weeks looking for when you'd be moved. You're the leverage. That's why the power went out. They needed to confirm which vehicle left the estate and where it went. They know where you are right now." She read it twice. Then she was off the bed and at the door before her brain had fully caught up with her feet. She opened the door. The hallway was empty. Carver was gone. She stood in the doorway of the apartment and looked at the empty hallway, the sconce lighting, the bland carpet, the elevator at the far end, and she felt the cold that had started at the back of her neck 3 hours ago arrive at something final. She went back inside and locked the door and pressed her back against it and thought. Carver had been with Lucien for 6 years. She knew this. She also knew, because she'd been paying attention in the way that living alongside Lucien had taught her to pay attention, that 6 years of loyalty meant nothing if the alternative offer was large enough or the threat was personal enough, or both. She looked at her phone, called Lucien. It rang 4 times, went to a recording that said the line was unavailable, called Renata. Same. She crossed to the secure line on the desk in the second bedroom and picked it up and listened for a dial tone and heard silence. Not dead silence, something worse. Active silence. The particular quality of a line that someone was already on, listening. She set the handset down carefully, like it was something that might react. Her overnight bag was on the bed. She went to it and unzipped the front pocket where she'd put her wallet and her documents and the small folding knife that Lucien had given her 4 months ago, and that she'd carried ever since without fully understanding why, some instinct in her reading the gift correctly without translating it. She put the knife in her jacket pocket. She sat on the edge of the bed and thought about exits. The apartment had the front door, which led to a hallway with an elevator and a stairwell. There was a service entrance at the back of the building. She knew this because she'd made herself learn the building the first time she'd stayed here. Another instinct she hadn't fully examined. 14 floors of stairs. The service entrance opened onto an alley that ran behind the building to a cross street. She had no car, no Carver, no functioning phone lines except her cell, which, she looked at it, showed 2 bars of signal. Enough. She called the one number she knew by heart that existed entirely outside Lucien's world. It rang 3 times. "Selene?" The voice was sleep-rough and confused. "It's 1 a.m. What?" "Harper," she said. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." Harper Quinn had been a bridal stylist at L'Etoile for 2 years before she'd watched Vivian Croft have a woman in a thrift store cardigan removed by security, and had spent the 3 days afterward feeling the specific self-disgust of someone who'd witnessed something wrong and done nothing. She'd resigned on a Tuesday. She'd received Celine's call on a Thursday. She was 26 years old and lived in a 4th-floor walk-up on Garland Street with a cat named Biscuit and an old Civic that she babied because she couldn't afford another one. And she had absolutely no context for what Selene Vale said to her at 1 a.m. in a flat, careful voice that contained no panic because the panic was being managed into something more useful. But she listened. She did exactly what Selene told her to do. She got dressed, got in the Civic, and drove to the address Selene gave her. Selene came out of the service entrance of the building on Wren Street at 1:47 and walked quickly to the mouth of the alley. Harper's Civic was idling at the curb with the headlights off, which Selene had specifically asked for. She got in. "Drive," she said. "Steady, not fast, left on Garland." Harper drove. She was gripping the steering wheel with both hands at the 10 and 2 positions like someone who had just graduated driver's ed, and her face in the dashboard light was very pale and very awake. "Are you okay?" Harper said. "I'm working on it. Keep driving." Selene watched the mirrors. Nobody behind them. Nobody turning when they turned. After 3 blocks, she let out a breath that she'd been holding in discrete pieces, managing it. "Where are we going?" Harper said. Selene looked at her phone. Tried Lucien again, still unavailable. She sat with that for a moment. The unavailability, what it might mean, the range of possibilities she refused to let herself arrange in order of likelihood. "I need somewhere I can make calls from without being found for a few hours," Selene said. "Somewhere not connected to me or to Lucien." Harper drove for a moment, then, "My apartment." You don't have to. My apartment, Harper said again, more firmly. Her voice had found a different register. Still scared, but something underneath the scared that was firmer than scared. It's not connected to either of you. Nobody knows me. Selene looked at her. You understand that if you're connected to this situation. I already quit my job because I watched them drag you out of a boutique, Harper said. I think I cleared the Easy Life bar a while ago. Selene almost laughed. Came out wrong. Shorter and sharper than a laugh. Something more jagged. Okay, she said. Your apartment. They reached Garland Street at 2:15. Biscuit greeted them at the door with the regal indifference of a cat who had decided everything was his business and none of his concern. The apartment was small and warm and cluttered with the organized chaos of someone who had turned a limited space into a real home. Fabric swatches on the table, a dress form in the corner of the living room wearing a half-finished bodice in dusty rows, bookshelves built from planks and brackets that held an improbable number of books about fashion history. Selene sat on Harper's couch and called every number she had for people in Lucien's organization who existed outside the direct chain of command. 3 didn't answer. 1 answered and said something in a voice so careful and controlled it communicated more than a direct sentence would have. She asked 2 questions and got 1 answer. The estate had been hit, not a siege, not the prolonged armed standoff that the word attack conjured, something more surgical. A team had come through the north perimeter at approximately 1 in the morning, the same time the Wren Street power line issue had been designed to resolve, confirming her location. The team was already inside before the outer security had fully understood the approach vector. How bad? She said to the careful voice on the other end. Contained, the voice said. Mr. Moretti is... A pause. Not available at this time. The cold arrived in her chest fully now, not traveling, just there, complete. Tell me what not available means, she said. Another pause. I'm not in a position to confirm. Tell me what it means right now or I'm going to get in a car and drive to that estate myself. And you know I will. A long silence. Then, he was moved. During the engagement, we don't have a confirmed location. She sat with that. The cat had jumped onto the couch beside her and was pressing its warm weight against her thigh, which was an absurd comfort that she accepted without thinking about it. Was he... She stopped. Is he alive? We believe so. We don't have confirmation. She ended the call. Harper was standing in the kitchen doorway with 2 mugs and an expression of someone who was working very hard to be useful in a situation that had no obvious use for her. Coffee, she said. Or there's tea. Coffee, Selene said. Then, thank you. She held the mug when Harper brought it and looked at the half-finished bodice on the dress form across the room and felt the walls of the situation pressing inward with a slow, measured persistence that was almost worse than a sudden collapse. A slow pressing was something you had to decide about. A sudden collapse made the decision for you. Lucien moved. Location unknown. Estate hit. Carver gone. Whether dead or bought, she didn't know. The unknown number with information that had saved her life tonight, or possibly positioned her to think it had been saved. She didn't know which. She put the coffee down and picked up her phone and navigated to the unknown number and typed, "Who are you?" The response came back in under a minute. Someone who has been watching this situation longer than you have. The attack tonight was always going to be about you. Orlov needed you as leverage to pull Lucien into the open. He's been trying to get Lucien to show movement for 6 months. Lucien's kept him blocked at every angle. You were the only angle left. She read it, then typed, "Why are you telling me this?" Because Lucien can't fix this from wherever he is right now. And you need to understand that the only way this ends is if Orlov no longer sees you as useful leverage. She stared at that for a long moment. How do I stop being useful leverage? The answer took longer this time. Almost 2 minutes. When it came, it was 4 words. Stop being the target. At 4 in the morning, Harper fell asleep on the couch with the cat on her feet and a half-empty mug going cold on the table beside her. Selene sat in the armchair across from her and watched the darkness outside the window, and let herself think through the things she'd been avoiding thinking through since she'd read those 4 words. She was the target because she was Lucien's vulnerability, the one thing he'd failed to armor, because you can't armor someone you love without destroying what you love about them. She'd understood this about their dynamic for a long time, without letting herself examine its implications. The fact that he had willingly left himself exposed by letting her matter, by letting her exist in his life as a real person rather than a protected asset, by loving her the way he did, which was visible to people who watched him, and people who hated him were people who watched him. Orlov had watched him, and now Lucien was somewhere she couldn't reach in a situation that was moving without her, and the only way she knew to make herself safer, to make him safer, to remove the angle Orlov was using, was to stop being the thing they thought she was. A woman who didn't know the territory. A woman who needed to be moved to a safe house when the power went out. A woman who could be used. She thought about Lucien's hands, showing her things. Strategy, leverage, emotional control. He'd started quietly over the past months, not as formal lessons, but as conversations, as observations, as small demonstrations that she'd absorbed without fully realizing she was absorbing them. This is how you read a room. This is how you know who in a negotiation is actually holding the weight. This is how you make a person understand the cost of a decision without threatening them. She'd been a student of his world without taking the enrollment seriously. She took it seriously now. She reached for her phone one more time and found the number for a woman named Serafina Moretti, Lucien's mother, which she had stored in her phone for 8 months and never once dialed. Serafina Moretti was the only person in Lucien's world who had more information about its architecture than Lucien himself, because she had built the original structure before Lucien had been old enough to understand what he was inheriting. She was also the woman who had stood in the main hall of the estate 2 months after Selene had moved in and told her with the polished cruelty of someone delivering a professional assessment that kindness was a liability and love was a luxury that women in their position could not afford. Selene had walked away from that conversation with her chin up and her hands shaking. She thought about it now differently. Serafina hadn't been trying to be cruel. Or not only cruel, she'd been trying to say something true about the world she'd survived, using the only language that world had taught her. Selene looked at the contact, put her thumb over the call button. The cat opened one eye from Harper's feet, looked at her, closed it again. She pressed call. It rang twice. "It's 4 in the morning," Serafina Moretti said. Her voice had the quality of someone who had not been asleep, not even close to asleep, probably hadn't considered sleeping tonight. "I know," Selene said. "I need to meet with you." A silence. Not surprised. More like a silence that was confirming a calculation it had already made. "You know where I am," Serafina said. "Yes." "Come at 6. A brief pause. "Come alone. If you bring anyone from Lucien's security team, I won't open the door." "Understood." And Selene. The use of her name. Direct, unadorned, no inflection of condescension or contempt. Just the name. "Lucien is alive. I spoke to him 40 minutes ago. He's been moved to a secondary location, and his communications are being managed to prevent Orlov from triangulating his position." Selene closed her eyes, pressed 2 fingers against her forehead. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Serafina said. "We have a great deal to discuss, and most of it you're not going to want to hear." The call ended. Selene sat in the armchair in Harper Quinn's small, warm apartment and looked at the dress form in the corner. The unfinished bodice in dusty rows, half-made and suspended, waiting for someone to decide what it would become. She thought about what Serafina had said to her 2 months into living at the estate, the words she'd replayed in her head and resented and occasionally woken from bad dreams hearing. Love is meaningless in this world without power. Kindness gets people buried. Women who refuse to become monsters never survive beside men like my son. She'd taken it as an attack. She'd been wrong. It wasn't an attack. It was a warning from someone who had learned everything the hardest possible way and had delivered it badly and had been right about most of it. Not all of it. Selene was still sure about the not all of it, but enough. She looked at her hands in the dark. Steady. Both of them. The same hands that had touched the hem of a couture wedding gown in a boutique on Kellerman Avenue 4 days ago. 4 days. It felt like a different geography, a different version of herself standing in wet sneakers trying to have one untouched thing. There was no untouched thing. She understood that now with a clarity that felt less like loss and more like putting down a weight she hadn't admitted she was carrying. She stood up, moved to Harper's kitchen and washed her face at the sink with cold water and looked at herself in the small mirror above the faucet. The woman looking back at her was tired and clear-eyed and had no particular expression. She thought, okay, not hopeful, not resolved, just okay. The single syllable of someone who has finished deciding. She turned off the tap, dried her face, walked back to the armchair. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window and waited for 5 o'clock, when she would wake Harper and explain what she needed, and then for 6 o'clock, when she would walk into a room with Serafina Moretti and sit down at the table she'd been avoiding for 2 years. The cat moved from Harper's feet to the arm of the chair and pressed its warm weight against Selene's elbow. She let it stay. Outside, the city was doing what cities do before dawn, running on the bones of itself, the skeleton crews and the delivery trucks, and the people who lived in the hours that other people slept through. The sky above the buildings was still fully dark, no suggestion yet of morning. But the dark at 4:59 was not the same dark as the dark at midnight. It had a different quality, an imminence, the specific dark of something that was about to change, not because anyone had decided it should, but because that was simply what time did, whether you were ready for it or not. Selene looked at it and did not look away. And somewhere across the city, in a room she hadn't been to yet, Serafina Moretti was already sitting at a table with 2 cups of coffee going cold and a file that she had been deciding for 8 months whether to show her son's future wife, and had finally decided tonight, with Lucien's communications managed and the estate compromised and the girl sitting somewhere alone for the first time in 2 years, was the night she had run out of reasons to wait. The file contained information about Mikhail Orlov. It also contained information about a decision Serafina had made 12 years ago. A decision that had set in motion, in ways no one had fully traced yet, the chain of events that had put Selene Vale in a wet sneakers thrift store cardigan on a sidewalk outside a boutique on Kellerman Avenue 4 days ago. A decision that meant the attack tonight was not simply about leverage. It was about a debt. And the person Orlov believed owed it was not Lucien, it was Serafina. Selene sat with that sentence in her chest for the 3 seconds it took her to understand it fully, and then she was on her feet and pulling on her jacket and shaking Harper's shoulder before the understanding had finished arriving. Harper came awake fast, eyes open, body upright, the reflexes of someone who had been sleeping lightly in a tense situation. "I need to go," Selene said. "I need you to stay here with the door locked and not open it for anyone. Can you do that?" "Yes." No hesitation. "Are you—" "I'm going to be okay. I'll call you." She was out the door before Harper could say anything else. But the streets at 5:40 in the morning had the specific emptiness of a city between shifts, not dead, not alive, just suspended. Selene walked 3 blocks before she flagged a car on the ride app she'd downloaded 6 months ago and never used because there was always Carver, always the black armored vehicle, always the infrastructure of someone else's protection surrounding her without her having to arrange it. The driver didn't speak. She sat in the back and watched the city move past and held her phone in both hands and thought about the file Serafina had mentioned without mentioning. 12 years ago, Serafina Moretti had made a decision. Something that had set in motion a chain of events that ended with a woman in wet sneakers being thrown out of a boutique. Something that Orlov was using as the basis of a debt. The geometry of it was not yet clear, but the shape was beginning to emerge from the dark, the way shapes emerge when your eyes adjust. Not gradually getting clearer, but suddenly visible, all at once, when the threshold tips. Serafina lived in a townhouse on Velden Street, 20 minutes from the estate, which put her close enough to be connected to Lucien's world and far enough to maintain the fiction of independence. Selene had been there twice, both times with Lucien, both times for occasions that had the structure of family but the atmosphere of a negotiation. The car stopped at the corner of Velden. She paid and got out. The townhouse had lights in the ground floor windows. She climbed the 4 stone steps to the front door and knocked. The door opened in under 10 seconds, which meant Serafina had been standing close to it. She looked exactly as she always looked, immaculate, structured, the silver-streaked hair pinned precisely, wearing a dark blazer over a silk blouse at 6 in the morning, as though she had not slept and had not considered changing as a concession to that fact. Her eyes moved over Selene with the quick, comprehensive assessment of someone who has spent decades reading people for operational information. "You're not hurt," she said. "No." "Good." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." The table in Serafina's study had 2 cups of coffee on it, cold, as Selene had imagined, a file folder between them, closed, the kind of manila folder that looked aggressively unremarkable. Serafina sat on one side. Selene sat on the other. Neither of them touched the file. "Tell me what you know," Serafina said. "Orlov hit the estate tonight because I was the leverage target, not Lucien." Selene kept her voice flat and informational. "Someone, an unknown contact, warned me before the team reached the Wren Street apartment. Carver was gone when I got to the hallway. I got out through the service entrance." "Carver is dead," Serafina said. The same flat informational register. His body was found in a maintenance corridor at 11:45. He wasn't bought. He was killed by the advance team before the main approach, which means Orlov's people were inside the building before the power went out. Selene processed this. The distinction mattered. Carver hadn't sold her. He'd been removed. There was a particular grief attached to that, small and sudden. A man she'd barely spoken to who had positioned himself between her and a door and died for it without ceremony. "The text messages," Selene said. "The unknown number, you sent them." Serafina's expression didn't change. "Yes." "The first one, about Nadia." "Yes." "Why didn't you just tell me directly?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me," Serafina said. It wasn't contemptuous, just factual. "You needed to arrive at it yourself. If I told you your closest friend was feeding information to a member of Lucien's organization, you would have dismissed it, possibly told Lucien, who would have handled it in his own way, which would have removed your agency from the situation entirely." She folded her hands on the table. "I needed you to understand it yourself so that you'd know how to handle it yourself." Selene looked at her. "You've been managing me. I've been preparing you." The distinction in Serafina's voice was precise. "There's a difference. Tell me about the file." Serafina looked at it. Then she looked at Selene. Not the swift operational assessment she'd done at the door, but something longer, more human. The look of someone who has been holding a weight for a long time and is deciding whether the person across the table is strong enough to take it. 12 years ago, she said, I was managing the Eastern port contracts that Lucien now considers foundational to the organization's current structure. Mikhail Orlov was an emerging operator in the same territory. We entered into an agreement. She paused. As part of that agreement, I provided him with information that allowed him to neutralize a competitor. The competitor was a man named Vasil Pren. I don't know that name. No, you wouldn't. Serafina's hand stayed folded. Vasil Pren had a daughter. She was 8 years old at the time. When Pren was neutralized, she went into the child welfare system in this state. Her mother had died 2 years earlier. Selene felt something begin to move in the back of her chest, something slow and preparatory. Her name in the system, Serafina said, was changed from Pren to a foster family surname. She was moved 3 times between the ages of 8 and 14. She eventually aged out of the system in the warehouse district of Black Ridge City. The pause that followed was extremely short. She got a job, several jobs. She was, by all accounts, resilient. The slow movement in Selene's chest had arrived at a destination. She couldn't breathe. Her name in the system, Serafina said, was Selene Varez. She changed it herself at 17 to Vale. The room was absolutely silent. Selene looked at the file folder on the table between them, then at Serafina's face, which had taken on the quality of someone who has said the irreversible thing and is now simply waiting in its aftermath. My father, Selene said. Vasil Pren. Yes. She put her hands flat on the table, both of them. She kneaded the surface, needed the physical reality of the wood under her palms, while the information she'd just been given rearranged everything she thought she knew about the shape of her life. You destroyed my family, she said. Yes. And Lucien, does Lucien know? Serafina's voice stayed even, but something had shifted in it, a careful quality. Lucien does not know. He inherited the Eastern port contracts without the history that produced them. I kept the Pren situation separate from everything I transferred to him. For 12 years. Yes. And Orlov knows. Orlov has known since last year. He discovered the connection between you and Pren through other means. He has been using it to build a case that I owe him something, that my involvement in the Pren situation represented a breach of an older agreement between us that I violated for my own benefit. Serafina unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table in a gesture that almost mirrored Selene's. He is not wrong about the breach, but the debt he is claiming is not proportionate, and he has been escalating his demands to a point that makes any continued arrangement impossible. He's using me, Selene said, to pull you out, not Lucien. Lucien is the obstacle. You are the lever. Serafina held her gaze. If Orlov takes you, he has leverage over both of us, over Lucien through love and over me through guilt. It is an elegant play. Elegant, Selene said, and the word came out with something in it that wasn't quite her normal voice, a rougher texture, something that had been sitting underneath the controlled surface all night and was beginning to push through.
I know what I did, Serafina said. I have known what I did for 12 years. I am not asking you to... Stop.
Selene's voice had gone flat in a different way than before. Not controlled flat, just empty of the things she would normally use to soften the delivery. Stop managing the conversation. You told me this at 6 a.m. with a file on a table because you needed me to have the information before Orlov used it as a weapon. That's operational. I understand operational. What I'm asking you, what I need you to answer right now, is where is Lucien and how do we end this? Serafina looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face changed by a very small degree. Something that in a less controlled person would have been visible as surprise or respect, or possibly both. Lucien is at the Caro facility, she said, 40 minutes east. He's contained there by choice. Every communication he sends can be monitored by Orlov's people right now, so he is managing his movements to prevent them from acquiring any more targeting information. He knows you're out. He doesn't know where. And Orlov. Orlov's main team is currently staged at a property on the south side of Black Ridge. He's waiting for confirmation of your location before he moves. Selene looked at the file. Is everything in there? Everything relevant, including enough to give Orlov a reason to stop. Serafina's eyes narrowed very slightly. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Selene said, and she pulled the file toward her and opened it, that Orlov's play is elegant because it depends on us being reactive. It depends on Lucien hiding and me running, and you sitting here with your hands folded waiting for someone else to make the next move. She looked at the first page. Dense. Names, dates, account numbers, the architecture of a 12-year-old agreement and its aftermath. I'm thinking that a play that depends on the other side being reactive stops working the moment someone decides to move first. You don't have... Serafina stopped, started again. The kind of move you're describing requires resources and knowledge, and I have resources. Selene turned a page. Lucien's been teaching me for 6 months. Maybe not the way he would have if he'd known I was paying attention, but I've been paying attention. She looked up at Serafina. And I have you. Right now this morning, I have you and everything in this file and the fact that Orlov doesn't know any of that. She held the older woman's gaze. Help me. Silence. Serafina Moretti sat across from the woman her son was going to marry and looked at her with the particular expression of someone recalculating something they thought they'd already calculated correctly. Then she stood up, went to the cabinet on the far wall, opened it, came back to the table with a second file, thicker than the first, and a phone that wasn't her regular phone. There are 3 people in this city, she said, sitting back down, who Orlov cannot function without. His accountant, his port liaison, and a woman named Dasha Kern who manages his communications infrastructure. If all 3 become unavailable to him simultaneously, his ability to coordinate the kind of action he's been staging collapses. She opened the second file. I have been building the means to make all 3 unavailable for 4 months. I was waiting for a moment when deploying it would be worth the exposure. Selene looked at the file. This is the moment. This is the moment, Serafina agreed. They looked at each other across the table. I need to tell Lucien, Selene said. If you contact Lucien, Orlov's people will triangulate. I know. She picked up the phone Serafina had brought from the cabinet. That's why I'm not going to contact him directly. She thought for a moment. Renata, she's clean? As far as I know. Find out for certain. Right now. I need a clean line to the Caro facility within the next hour. Serafina reached for her own phone without further argument. While she made the call, Selene read the second file. She read it the way Lucien had taught her to read documents that mattered. Not front to back, but looking first for the load-bearing elements, the pieces that held the structure up, the names and numbers and relationships that everything else depended on. She found them. She marked them in her head. She built the architecture of it in her mind, the way you build a room before you walk into it, knowing where the walls are, where the door is, where the light comes from. It took her 20 minutes. By then, Serafina had confirmed Renata was clean and had a line to the Caro facility that was routed through 3 dead-end relays and would take Orlov's monitoring infrastructure approximately 40 minutes to trace, if they were looking at the right thread, which they wouldn't be, because Serafina had also put 2 decoy communications in motion simultaneously. 30 minutes, Serafina said. After 30 minutes, this line is compromised regardless. Selene picked up the phone. It rang once. Who is this? Lucien's voice, alert, hard. The voice of a man who had been awake all night managing something with no clean edges and had answered an unknown number with the specific wariness of someone who had no patience left for anything that wasn't essential. It's me, she said. A silence of about 2 seconds that contained more than most conversations. Are you hurt? He said. No, listen to me. I have 30 minutes on this line. I'm with your mother. Another 2-second silence. I see. She told me about Pren. The silence this time was different, longer. She could hear him breathing, just barely, but she knew the sound of it. Selene, we don't have time for that right now. I need you to listen and not argue and trust me. Can you do that? A beat. Then, yes. She told him the plan. Not all of it. The line was 30 minutes and she used 12, giving him the structural elements, the 3 targets, the timing, the role she needed him to play, which was, and she understood how much this cost him when she said it, nothing. Stay at Caro, stay off communications, be unreachable for the next 4 hours and let her and Serafina move. When she finished, there was silence. Lucien, I heard you. Will you do it? You're asking me to sit in a room for 4 hours while you… Yes. Selene, if something goes wrong, then it goes wrong and you come out of Caro with everything you have and you handle it. But it's not going to go wrong. She said it not with bravado, but with the flat certainty of someone who has read the files and done the math. Orlov's play requires us to be where he expects us. We're not going to be where he expects us. A long silence. She could picture him. The jaw, the dark eyes, the contained fury of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the one who made the moves and was now being asked to hold still while someone he loved walked into the situation he'd been managing. 4 hours, he said. 4 hours. And then I come out. And then you come out. And Selene, his voice had dropped a register, lost the operational quality for just a moment. The thing about Pren, about your father, we're going to… I know, she said. When this is over. When this is over, he said. And then quietly, I didn't know. I know you didn't. She let that sit for 1 second. 4 hours, Lucien. She ended the call, set the phone down. Serafina was watching her from across the table with an expression that was still very controlled, but had a layer beneath the control that was less familiar. Something that might have been, in another person, the beginning of a different kind of regard. The accountant, Selene said. How do we reach him? The next 3 hours moved in a different quality of time. Not the suspended, unreal time of waiting or the frantic time of running, but the dense, pressurized time of action that has been precisely sequenced and is now executing. Every minute had weight, every call, every message, every coordinated step had a cost and a consequence that Selene tracked with the part of her brain that had been quietly learning for 6 months without announcing itself. Serafina's network was older than Lucien's in the way that foundations are older than buildings, less visible, more essential. She moved through it with an efficiency that was unsentimental and total, making contact through channels that left specific traces designed to look like other traces, setting pieces in motion with the economy of language of someone who had been doing this longer than Selene had been alive. The accountant, a man named Ferris, who handled Orlov's financial infrastructure across 4 shell entities, received a package of documentation at 7:15 in the morning. The package came from a source he trusted and contained information about his own accounts. Information that made very clear that his continued cooperation with Orlov had a specific and imminent cost attached to it that he had not previously been aware of. The package also contained, without explicit comment, a suggested alternative. Ferris went dark within 20 minutes. His phone stopped responding. His office showed no signs of activity. He had effectively ceased to exist as a functional piece of Orlov's operational infrastructure. The port liaison, a woman named Teresa, who managed the physical access points that made Orlov's import and export operations viable, was handled differently. She received a visit at her home office from 2 people who had the specific quality of people you don't say no to, carrying paperwork that represented a legal exposure she'd apparently been unaware of. The visit was brief. Teresa made 3 calls after the visitors left. None of them were to Orlov. Dasha Kern, the communications manager, was the hardest because she was genuinely loyal. Not bought loyalty, actual loyalty. The kind that doesn't respond to documentation packages or legal exposure because it isn't based on calculation. Selena read the file on her while Serafina handled Ferris and understood what she was looking at. A woman who had been with Orlov for 9 years because he had done something significant for her family at a moment when no one else would. "We can't flip her," Selene said. Serafina looked up from her phone. "No. So we isolate her. We don't need her to switch sides. We need her infrastructure to go dark." She looked at the file. She routes everything through a server cluster managed by a third-party vendor in this city. If the vendor has a technical crisis this morning... Serafina was already dialing before Selene finished the sentence. At 8:47, Dasha Kern's communications infrastructure experienced what would later be described as a cascading server failure of indeterminate origin. The window of disruption was, by professional estimates, 4 to 6 hours. At 8:51, Selene's phone rang. Unknown number. Different unknown number from the ones before. She answered it. "Ms. Vale." The voice on the other end was calm, measured, carrying the specific quality of a man who had spent years perfecting the performance of equanimity while experiencing something very different. "I think we should meet." "Mr. Orlov," she said. She felt Serafina go completely still across the table. "You've had an active morning," Orlov said. His accent was faint, somewhere Eastern European, decades spent in America, the edges worn smooth. "My accountant is unavailable. My port contact appears to be cooperating with parties I don't recognize, and Dasha is experiencing some technical difficulties." "How inconvenient," Selene said. "Yes." A pause. "You've been busy for someone who was supposed to be running." "I wasn't running," she said. "I was letting you think I was running." "I see." Another pause. Longer. "You understand that this changes the conversation we need to have." "I'm counting on it." Serafina had her hand out. She wanted the phone. Selene looked at her and shook her head once. "I want to meet," Orlov said. "In person, today." "You want to meet because your leverage is gone," Selene said. "I want to be clear that I understand why we're talking." "You're not what I expected," Orlov said. And there was something in his voice, not admiration, not quite. More like the recalibration of a man who had been playing against an opponent he'd underestimated and was updating his assessment in real time. "Nobody is," Selene said. "When do you want to meet?" "Noon. I'll send a location." "You'll tell me the location now. I'll confirm attendance in 1 hour." A silence. She could hear him deciding. The weight of it transmitted through the phone line like barometric pressure. "Callaway Hotel on 5th, he said. "The conference suite on 12. 1 hour, she said, and ended the call. She set the phone down on the table and looked at her hands for a moment. Steady, both of them. Still steady. She was aware of her heartbeat, elevated, not racing. The specific rate of someone who was managing adrenaline rather than being managed by it. Serafina was watching her. You're going to meet him, Serafina said. Yes, that's... His play requires me to be the target, Selene said. The target doesn't show up to meetings. The target runs and hides and gives leverage meaning. If I walk into that room at noon, I stop being the target. She looked at Serafina. And when I stop being the target, Lucien can come out of Caro. He'll still be dangerous, Serafina said. In that room. I know. He's been doing this for 30 years, Selene. Whatever you think you... I'm not going in there to win a fight, she said. I'm going in there to have a conversation. There's a difference. She picked up the second file, the thicker one, and tapped its edge against the table. I'm going in there with everything that's in here, and with the knowledge that his 3 key people are currently non-operational, and with the understanding that Orlov has been trying to collect a debt that should never have existed. She paused. And I'm going in there without Lucien, which means he'll underestimate what I know and what I can do, which is the only real advantage I have, and I intend to use it completely. Serafina was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You'll need a different jacket. Selene looked at her. What you're wearing is fine for running through service exits at 2 in the morning, Serafina said. It's not fine for walking into the Callaway at noon. She stood. Come upstairs. No. At 11:15, Selene stood in the marble bathroom of Serafina Moretti's townhouse and looked at herself in the mirror. Dark blazer, clean lines, hair back. No visible Lucien, no visible empire, no visible fear. Just a woman in a jacket that cost more than her old monthly rent, standing straight, looking at herself with the expression of someone who has already made the decision and is simply waiting for the clock to confirm the appointment. She reached into her pocket. The folding knife was still there. She left it there. She thought about the boutique on Kellerman Avenue, the wet sidewalk, Marcus's hand on her arm, the small mean laugh from the display case, the woman in thrift store sneakers that they'd seen and dismissed in 2 seconds, who they'd been completely right to dismiss because that woman, that version, had nothing that would have made them wrong to dismiss her. She thought, I'm not that woman right now. Then she thought more carefully, I'm exactly that woman. I'm just also something more than she knew. She put the knife in the inside pocket of the blazer where it sat clean and flat against the lining. At 11:30, she walked down Serafina's stairs and through the front door and into the cold, bright morning and stood on the top step and looked at the city and breathed. Serafina appeared in the doorway behind her, stood there, said nothing for a moment. Then, Selene. She turned. Serafina Moretti's face was doing something Selene had never seen it do, something that involved both the precise structure of the woman she was and the faint, barely visible evidence of the woman she had been before 30 years in a world that rewarded ruthlessness had fully shaped her. I made a decision 12 years ago, she said. It was the right decision for the organization and a catastrophic decision for a child I never considered. She paused. I'm not going to ask you to... I know, Selene said. We'll deal with that. Not today. Today I go to the Callaway Hotel and I sit across from the man who has been using my dead father's name as a financial instrument, and I end this. She looked at Serafina steadily. And when it's over, we'll have a different conversation. A longer one. But that's when. Serafina looked at her for a moment longer. Then she gave a single, precise nod. Selene turned and walked down the steps toward the car she'd arranged while Serafina was upstairs. A clean car, no connection to anyone, a driver she'd found through Harper's neighbor who drove for a rideshare company and had no idea who he was driving. The Callaway Hotel was 14 minutes away. She had 14 minutes to decide exactly how much of what she knew she was going to use, and in what order, and what she was willing to trade and what she wasn't, and where the line was between ending this and becoming the thing she'd promised herself she wouldn't become. 14 minutes was enough. She'd done the math already. She knew where the lines were. She knew what she had, what Orlov had, what the room would look like when she walked in, and what it needed to look like when she walked out. What she didn't know, couldn't know, no amount of file reading and preparation could answer it, was what Orlov would do when he understood, fully and completely, that the leverage he'd been building for 6 months had dissolved overnight. Whether he'd negotiate, or whether he'd decide that the woman who'd dissolved it was herself now the only thing worth taking. The car pulled onto Fifth Avenue. The Callaway's entrance was visible ahead. Marble facade, uniformed doormen, the controlled grandeur of a building that had been hosting difficult conversations behind expensive walls for 80 years and had learned to look indifferent to whatever happened inside them. Selene's phone buzzed. A text from Lucien. Clean number. He'd moved, which meant the 4 hours were up, which meant he was... Lucien's text was 4 words. I'm out. Where are you? She looked at it for 1 second, then typed back. Callaway Hotel, 5th. Conference Suite 12. Don't come in. His response came in under 10 seconds. Selene. She turned the phone face down on the seat. The car stopped at the Callaway's entrance. The driver said nothing. She got out, straightened the blazer, and walked through the doors without pausing, the specific gait of someone who belongs in a place, who has always belonged in a place, who has never once stood on a wet sidewalk outside a building wondering if she had the right to enter. The lobby was exactly what the Callaway's facade promised, marble and restrained gold, and the particular hush of a space that had been soundproofed against the ordinary world. A concierge looked up. She met his eyes and walked past him toward the elevators with the directness of someone with an appointment, which she had, and he said nothing. 12 floors. She watched the numbers rise. She thought about her father, Vasile Pren, a name she hadn't known existed until 4 hours ago, attached to a man she had no memory of. She'd been 8 years old, and the system had moved her fast and changed her name faster, and whatever memories she carried from before the age of 8 had been stored in a part of herself she'd learned not to excavate, because there was nothing there that helped her with the life she had to live. She had a father's name now. She had a shape for the absence that had always been in the back of everything. She had time to feel all of that. Later. Not in the next however long, not in whatever was about to happen on the 12th floor, but later, in some room that wasn't this one, with Lucien or without him, she would sit with Vasile Pren and what his existence and destruction meant. Later. The elevator opened. The conference suite on 12 had a set of double doors that looked like every other conference suite door in every upscale hotel in America. Dark wood, brushed metal handles, the faint institutional quality of a space that served as neutral ground for negotiations that needed a neutral look. She pushed through without knocking. The room was large, windows on 2 sides looking out over Fifth Avenue and the city beyond. A long table in the center, dark wood, a dozen chairs, only 2 occupied. Mikhail Orlov sat at the far end with his hands flat on the table and a cup of coffee to his right that was probably cold. A man stood near the windows to Orlov's left, large, still, the specific posture of security that was also an implicit threat and a reminder of what kind of meeting this was. Orlov was older than she'd expected, somewhere in his mid-60s, with a face that had the weathered, oddly peaceful quality of someone who had been doing difficult things for so long that the difficulty had stopped registering as difficulty. Silver hair cut close, dark eyes behind glasses with thin frames. He was wearing a suit that was expensive but not ostentatious, the clothes of a man who had moved past the stage of using appearance to communicate power, because his power was old enough to not need communicating. He looked at her when she came in. His expression didn't change. She walked the length of the table and sat down 4 chairs from him. Not across, not beside, the particular distance of someone who had chosen their geometry deliberately. She set the folder from Serafina's file on the table in front of her. She did not open it. You came alone, Orlov said. Yes. Lucien Moretti is currently in a vehicle approximately 6 blocks from this building, he said. I have people watching the entrance. I know, she said. Orlov looked at the folder. Is that what I think it is? It's documentation of a 12-year-old arrangement between you and Serafina Moretti. The Pren termination, the agreed terms, the subsequent breach, and the years of correspondence about the debt you've been claiming since. She put her hand on top of the folder. I've read all of it. A silence. The man by the window had not moved. You've had an education this morning, Orlov said. I've had several. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Orlov, Vasile Pren was my father. The silence this time had a different quality. Orlov looked at her, really looked at her, the kind of looking that was trying to locate something, verify something, run a calculation it hadn't prepared for. I was told his daughter was... He stopped. In the system, yes. Then out of the system, working 3 jobs in the warehouse district. She kept her voice even. Then, through a sequence of events that nobody planned, in a relationship with the son of the woman who gave you the information that let you kill him. She paused. That's an extraordinary coincidence, Mr. Orloff. I've been sitting with it for 4 hours trying to decide if it is a coincidence.
It is,
Orlov said, and she heard something in his voice that she hadn't expected, a flatness that wasn't defensive but exhausted. I didn't know who you were until last year. By the time I understood the connection, the situation between you and Lucien Moretti was already, he gestured slightly, what it is. And you decided to use it. I decided to use what I had. He looked at the folder. Serafina Moretti owes a debt. The nature of the debt changed when I understood what she'd done and who you were. But the debt was real before that understanding, and it remains real. What was the original debt? Selene said. The Pren termination was supposed to open territory that she and I would develop jointly. She developed it alone, took the territory, took the contracts, built what became the foundation of the Moretti organization's Eastern operations. I got a pause, a fraction of what was agreed. For 10 years, I let it sit because the arrangement still had value, and confronting it wasn't worth the cost. He turned his coffee cup slightly on the table, a small, absent gesture. Then last year I found the file that told me who you were, and I understood that the cost Serafina had actually paid for that territory was paid by a child who didn't agree to pay it. That changed the calculation. Selene looked at him. You've been doing this for 6 months because you found out what happened to me. I've been doing this for 6 months because what happened to you is evidence of a specific kind of betrayal that I don't... He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. I've operated in this world for 30 years. There are things I've done, things I won't apologize for. But there are lines I have maintained, consistently. Children are one of those lines. He looked at her directly. What Serafina did to Vasil Pren's daughter, to you, crossed a line I have maintained for 30 years. And she did it without my knowledge. And the territory she took as a result benefited an organization I have been in conflict with ever since. The room was very quiet. Outside the windows, the city moved on with total indifference. Selene sat with what he'd said, turned it over, found the load-bearing parts of it, and tested them. You hit the estate last night to get me, she said. If you were trying to correct a wrong done to a child, you don't do it by putting that child in an armored vehicle in the middle of a firefight. Orlov's expression shifted slightly. Something in it acknowledged the weight of that without directly conceding it. The situation had evolved past the point where I had clean options. You had the option of calling me directly. You are engaged to Lucien Moretti. Calling you directly would have put information in his hands before I was ready for him to have it. So instead you killed my driver and sent a team into the estate where I live. Her voice had not risen. She kept it level and let the content do the work. That's not a man correcting an injustice. That's a man prosecuting an agenda and dressing it in language that sounds better than what it is. Orlov was quiet for a long moment. The man by the window had not moved. She was aware of him with the continuous peripheral awareness she'd been maintaining since she walked in. His position, his hands, the quality of his stillness, watching for the shift that would mean the conversation had ended. What do you want? Orlov said. I want this to end, you see, she said. Not a truce, not a renegotiated arrangement, an end. She opened the folder, turned it to face him, slid it 3 feet down the table toward his side. The documentation in here is complete. Serafina's breach of your original agreement is real and provable. The territory she took and what was built on it is quantifiable. She watched him look at it. I'm prepared to negotiate a settlement, financial, structured, specific, that closes the debt permanently and removes any basis for further action against Lucien's organization or against me. Orlov looked at the documents. His expression was impossible to read in the conventional sense. Too many years of having a face that gave nothing away. But his hands on the table were very still, which she had learned in the past hour of reading his file was what his hands did when he was thinking hard. You're authorized to negotiate this, he said, on behalf of the Moretti organization. I'm authorized by Serafina Moretti, who built the foundation this organization stands on, and who owes you a debt she has acknowledged to me directly this morning. She held his gaze. Lucien doesn't know the terms I'm prepared to offer. He will. But the opening of this negotiation is between you and me, which means it happens without the weight of his history with you in the room. That's the only way it ends cleanly. A long silence. If I agree to a negotiation, Orlov said slowly, it requires Serafina to be a direct party to the settlement. She will be. And Lucien will be informed and will honor what's agreed. That's my assurance. She paused. I'm going to ask you to take my assurance on that because I'm asking you to believe something you haven't had evidence of yet. But I'm the only person in this situation who has every reason to tell you the truth, because I'm the one whose father's name is in that file, and I'm the one who has been running through service exits at 2 a.m. because of how this situation has been managed, and I'm the one who wants it over more than anyone else in this room. Orlov looked at her for a long time. The city moved in the windows behind him. Then he looked at the man by the window and made a slight gesture. The man moved away from his position, crossed to the door, and went through it. They were alone. Sit closer, Orlov said. We have things to discuss that I don't want to say across 12 feet of table. She picked up the folder and moved 2 chairs closer, and they sat at a corner of the table and talked for an hour and 40 minutes. It was not a clean negotiation. Nothing was conceded easily, nothing was offered without examination. And there were 2 moments when the temperature in the room changed in a way that required Selene to manage her own steadiness against the pressure of a man who had 30 years of experience at exactly this. But she had the file, and she had the math, and she had the particular advantage of being someone he hadn't fully calculated for. And in the end, the terms that emerged were terms that both of them could stand behind. A financial settlement from the Moretti organization to Orlov, structured, specific, representing fair value for the territory taken 12 years ago with interest, Serafina's direct acknowledgement and signature, a permanent cessation of any claim against Lucien's organization and any member of it, the withdrawal of Orlov's operational presence from the eastern territories that had been Serafina's breach. In exchange, the documentation in the folder, all copies, would be retired. The correspondence about the debt would be sealed. The events of the past 6 months would be treated as a business dispute resolved through negotiation, rather than something that required further accounting. When they shook hands at the end, Orlov held hers for a moment longer than necessary. Your father, he said, Vasil Pren. He paused, as though the word needed to be chosen carefully. He was a man who understood that there were things worth more than territory. That was why Serafina had him removed. He had principles that interfered with what she needed from the arrangement. Selene looked at him. You're telling me that because you want me to know something about him. I'm telling you because you should know. He released her hand. He would have found it, not without irony, that his daughter ended up doing what she just did. She didn't say anything to that. She picked up what remained of the folder, buttoned her blazer, and walked to the door. At the door, she stopped. The information you got about me through Nadia Cross, she said. The member of Lucien's organization she was in contact with, Soto. Yes. Did you direct that? Or did it come to you? Orlov's expression gave the answer before his voice did. It came to me. I didn't recruit her. She made contact through a channel looking for... He paused. She was looking for information about you. About whether you were... He seemed to be choosing carefully again. Whether you were who you appeared to be, or something else. Selene thought about Nadia, the warm face, the 7 years, the specific loneliness of someone who had watched a friend's life change and had reached for the worst possible way to understand it. She was looking for proof that I didn't deserve it, she said. Not a question. Something like that. She nodded once, opened the door. Lucien was in the lobby. She had told him not to come in, and he had come in anyway, which was the most completely Lucien thing he had ever done. And when she came out of the elevator and saw him standing near the far wall in a dark coat with his hands loose at his sides, and the specific expression of a man who had spent the last 2 hours managing the impulse to walk through every door between himself and a situation involving someone he loved, she stopped for a moment and just looked at him. He crossed the lobby in about 6 strides. He didn't say anything. He put his hands on her face and looked at her. The full examination, the inventory, checking for damage with the thoroughness of someone for whom thoroughness was survival. And when he found none, some tension in him released by a fraction. "The 12th floor," he said. "Done." "Done how?" "Negotiated. Serafina needs to sign the settlement. I'll tell you everything, not here." He looked at her for another moment, reading something in her face that she wasn't trying to hide. The thing about Vasil Pren, the shape of it in her eyes. "You know," he said, "she told me." His jaw tightened. "Selene, I know you didn't know." She put her hand against his chest, not grasping, just present. "I know. We're going to talk about it, but not in a hotel lobby." He covered her hand with his, held it there for a moment. "Let's go home," she said. The estate had the quality of a place that had been through something and was in the process of returning to itself. There were men Selene didn't recognize working quietly on the north perimeter where the power line had been cut. The marble floors in the east corridor had been cleaned, but the cleaning had a freshness to it that acknowledged what had been there before. 3 windows in the security wing had been replaced, the new glass slightly different in its reflective quality from the old. She walked through it and let herself see it clearly. Not the managed, maintained version she'd been living inside, but the actual thing. A building designed around the assumption of violence. A home built by people who understood that beauty and danger were not opposites in this world, but constant companions. She'd been telling herself for 2 years that she was separate from this, adjacent to it, but not of it, keeping something in herself clean by refusing to look directly at what surrounded it. She looked now. She walked through every room on the main floor. The ballroom that had never been used for a ball. The library with its first editions and its panic room behind the east bookcase. The kitchen with its 2 exits and its windows angled to prevent clear sightlines from the garden. Every design choice had 2 purposes. Everything beautiful was also functional in a way that had nothing to do with beauty. Lucien watched her do this from the doorway of the library. He didn't try to explain or interpret. He just watched. When she'd finished, she came and stood beside him. "I've been pretending this was a house," she said. "It is a house. It's a fortress. It's both." He looked at the room. Most things are both. She thought about her apartment before all of this. The studio in the warehouse district, the secondhand furniture, and the single window that faced a brick wall, and the lock on the door that she'd replaced herself with a better one because the building super wasn't going to do it. That had been a fortress too, smaller, less marble, built from the same understanding that the world required you to take your own protection seriously because no one else was going to do it for you. "Tell me about your father," Lucien said. She turned to look at him. His face was open in the particular way it only was with her. The hard edges still there, always there, but something behind them that was different. Something that had been behind them from the beginning and that she had understood early on was the thing worth staying for. His name was Vasil Pren, she said. He had principles that interfered with Serafina's business arrangements. And he had a daughter who was 8 years old, and when he was gone, the daughter disappeared into the system, and the system moved her 3 times and changed her name, and taught her to expect nothing from the world because the world had already decided she didn't count. Lucien was very still. "And then the daughter grew up," Selene said, "and eventually ended up in the orbit of the family that, by a series of steps I'm still working through, had something to do with why she was in the system to begin with." A long silence. "Selene," his voice was rough in a way it rarely was, "I need you to understand." "I know." She turned to face him fully. "I know you didn't know. I know that whatever your mother did before you took over the organization is not something you chose or sanctioned or even knew about. I'm not—" She stopped, let out a breath. "I'm not holding you accountable for it." "You should," he said. "Maybe, but I'm not." She looked at him. "What I'm holding you accountable for is what comes next. What happens with the settlement, with Serafina, with the acknowledgement that what she did has a cost that isn't only financial. There's a name in that file, my father's name, and it deserves more than a line item in a business settlement. I'll make sure it has more than that, he said. Not as a promise, as a fact. The specific quality of Lucien Moretti stating something that was already decided. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Also, she said, I need to talk to Serafina, alone, without you in the room. He looked like he wanted to argue with that. She watched the argument form in his expression and then get set aside, which cost him something she could see it costing him. When? He said. Soon. Not today. He nodded once. So, she called Serafina that evening, not to arrange the meeting, just to say that the negotiation had concluded and the settlement needed to be signed, and that there would be a separate conversation between the two of them that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with a girl who had been 8 years old and had never been factored into any of the calculations. Serafina listened without interrupting. When Selene finished, there was a silence on the line. I'll sign the settlement, Serafina said, and I'll be available for the other conversation whenever you decide. You should know, Selene said, that I'm not coming to that conversation looking for an apology. What are you looking for? The truth. The whole truth. Not the operational version. Not the version that explains how the decision made sense at the time. The version where you say what actually happened to a child and what it cost her and whether you've spent any time in the last 12 years understanding the shape of it. A long pause. Yes, Serafina said. I have, considerably. Good, Selene said. Then we'll have something real to talk about. She ended the call and sat at the window of the bedroom and watched the last light go out of the sky over the estate garden. The wildflowers along the far wall had come back this year. She hadn't planted them. They'd appeared on their own in the spring, some wind-blown seed finding its way into ground that was formally maintained and blooming anyway with the indifference of things that don't know they're not supposed to. She thought about cutting them. They didn't match the garden's design. Too wild, too uncontrolled, too unplanned. She'd left them. She called Harper the next morning. Harper answered immediately and said the first 3 words in a rush. Are you okay? Before Selene could speak. I'm okay, Selene said. Thank you for last night. I didn't do much. You answered the phone. You drove to an address at 2 a.m. because a woman you barely knew asked you to. That's... Selene paused. That's not nothing. A brief silence. Then, are you... Is it over? Mostly. She looked out the window at the garden. Harper, the bridal studio. The independent one you've been thinking about. She heard Harper go still on the other end. I've been thinking about it a lot, actually. I'd like to help fund it. Selene kept her voice practical, because Harper was the kind of person who would balk at the emotion if she let it surface, who would find the practical version easier to accept. Not as charity, as an investment. You handle the design, the clients, the running of it. I provide the capital to get started and stay out of the creative process completely. Selene, I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm offering. She paused. I want a place to exist where brides get treated like what they are. People making a decision that matters to them, regardless of the number they can spend on it. She thought about wet sneakers on a marble floor, about a security guard's hand on her arm, about the small, mean laugh from the display case. I have a personal investment in that space existing. Harper was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, yeah, okay, yeah. I'll have Renata reach out about the financial structure. Okay? A pause. Selene, that woman at L'Etoile, Vivian Croft. Yes, I heard the boutique closed. It did. Did you? Harper stopped, started again. Was that was Lucien, Selene said honestly. I didn't ask him to do it. I also didn't ask him not to. She let that sit. I've made my peace with the fact that those are sometimes the same thing. 3 weeks later, she met Nadia. Not at a coffee shop. At the Cross Family Restaurant, which was a narrow, warm place on the east side that had been serving the same neighborhood for 22 years, and that smelled like garlic and old wood and the particular comfort of food made by people who understood that feeding someone was also a form of love. Nadia's parents were in the kitchen when Selene arrived. She heard them back there. She didn't ask to see them. That was a different visit for another time. Nadia was at a table near the window. She looked like she'd been awake for several days in the past 3 weeks, which was probably accurate. She looked like someone who had been sitting with the full weight of what she'd done without the mercy of distraction. Selene sat across from her. They looked at each other for a moment. "The restaurant is going to be okay," Selene said. "The loan restructuring is done. The kitchen equipment gets replaced next month." Nadia closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. "You didn't have to. I told you why I was doing it." Selene kept her voice level. Not cold, not warm. Present. "Because your parents are good people, and the restaurant is theirs, and they built it from nothing, and they deserve to keep it." "Selene, I'm not finished." She waited until Nadia stopped. "I'm not here to rebuild what we had. I don't think what we had can be rebuilt. 7 years doesn't disappear, but it also doesn't undo what happened, and I've been honest with myself about which one of those facts I have to live in." Nadia's hands were flat on the table. Her jaw was working. "What I'm here to tell you," Selene said, "is that I understand what happened. Not excuse it. Understand it. You watched my life change and you couldn't change with it. And the gap between where you were and where I was became something that stopped feeling like circumstance and started feeling like something I'd done to you. I know that feeling. I felt a version of it. It makes you—" She paused. "It makes you reach for things you wouldn't reach for if you weren't in pain." Nadia's eyes had overflowed. She wasn't making a sound, just sitting with the tears running down her face the way someone sits with rain. "I'm telling you this not because I'm okay," Selene said. "I'm telling you this because I made a choice, a long time before last week, about what kind of person I was going to be when the world treated me badly. And the world treated me very badly starting when I was 8 years old, and I made that choice 100 times, and I'm going to keep making it because it's the only thing I have that's entirely mine." She stood up. Nadia reached out, didn't quite touch her hand, stopped with her fingers an inch away. "Can we—" Her voice was almost nothing. "Is there any way that someday—" "I don't know," Selene said. Not a no, but I don't know. She looked at the table between them. "Take care of them." A slight movement of her head toward the kitchen. "They work too hard, and they close too late, and they deserve someone looking out for them." She walked to the door, stepped out onto the east side street. The air was cold and clean, and the street lights were coming on as the afternoon folded into evening. She breathed. The wedding was in April. Not a cathedral, not a ballroom, not the kind of production that the Moretti name could have assembled. The hundreds of guests, the imported flowers, the security presence at every entrance that would have made the whole thing feel like a state function wearing a veil. A garden. The one at the estate, where the wildflowers had come back along the far wall, where the old stones held the light in the late afternoon in a way that turned everything gold and unhurried. 14 people. The few that were genuine sifted from the many that were obligatory. Renata, standing in the back row with the expression of someone attending an event slightly outside their professional jurisdiction but choosing to be present anyway. Harper, who had spent 3 weeks arguing with Selene about the dress and had ultimately been allowed to make something that was simple and extraordinary in the way that things are extraordinary when they come from understanding rather than spectacle. Ivory silk, clean lines, nothing that required armor to wear. Mara Bellamy, the underground designer Harper had found, who had contributed a detail to the bodice that was technically perfect and practically invisible and meaningful to exactly the 2 people who knew what it referenced. Serafina, standing apart from the rest in a charcoal coat, her hands folded, her face doing the thing it had been doing for 3 weeks during the series of long conversations she and Selene had been having. The thing that was not quite peace, but was the beginning of the work that might eventually arrive at something in that territory. And Lucien. Lucien, who had offered 3 times to make the wedding whatever size and scale she wanted, and had been told each time with increasing specificity what she actually wanted, and who was standing at the far end of the garden path in the fading April light, looking at her with the expression he only had with her, that particular open quality underneath everything else, the thing that had been there from the beginning and that she had understood correctly, was the thing worth the cost of everything that had surrounded it. She walked toward him alone. No one gave her away. She had considered this carefully and decided that she had been given away once, at 8 years old, and had spent 16 years earning herself back, and this walk was hers. The light was gold and the wildflowers were moving slightly in the April air, and her dress was the weight of something made for her specifically, and her hands were steady and her eyes were open. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her face for a long moment. The full inventory, the thorough check. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. The person officiating said the words that needed saying. Selene listened and meant them. Lucien said his vows in the quiet, factual voice of someone stating truths rather than performing promises. That he would protect her, that he would be honest with her, that he would build a world alongside her rather than around her. When it was Celine's turn, she looked at him and said what she had decided to say, which was not what the template suggested, but what was actually true. She told him she wasn't going to protect him from everything, that she had no interest in being kept safe at the cost of being kept small. That she had spent 6 months learning the language of his world and intended to keep learning it and intended to use it, not to become what that world usually made people, but to remain what she had chosen to be despite what that world usually made people. She told him she would be honest with him when it was hard and stay when staying cost something, and build something alongside him that was worth the cost of what they had both paid to arrive at this garden on this afternoon in this light. She told him she loved him in the specific way she loved him, not the way of someone who needed him, but the way of someone who had chosen him with both eyes open after seeing everything. Lucien listened to all of it with the stillness of a man who has been running on the surface of something dangerous for 20 years and has finally found solid ground. When she finished, his jaw worked once. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to manage it. He let it happen, which for Lucien was the most significant thing he'd ever done in front of other people. She reached up and put her hand on his face and felt him lean into it, just slightly, the weight of a man putting something down after carrying it for a very long time. The years that followed had their own weight and texture. Lucien remained what he was, feared, precise, operating in a world that didn't change its nature because one person inside it had changed hers. But the center of gravity shifted in increments. Violence became later in the sequence. Negotiation became earlier. Not because Lucien had become soft, but because someone he listened to had a longer view and used it consistently, and he had been honest enough with himself to follow it. The foundation took 3 years to build properly. Not to fund, Selene had the funding, but to build in the way that would outlast any single year's effort, the institutional structure that would still be running when the specific urgency that created it had faded. Women denied opportunities because of poverty, discrimination, the casual cruelty of gatekeeping. The machinery of second chances. Harper's studio opened on a Tuesday in March, with 12 appointments booked, and a small sign above the door that said the name in simple letters and nothing else. Every bride who came through the door was greeted the same way, regardless of what they were carrying. Their budget, their history, their complicated feelings about what this day meant and what it cost to want it. Word spread the way good things spread, which is slowly and then all at once. Vivian Croft's application came across Celine's desk 2.5 years after the boutique closed. It was thorough. It laid out a situation that was genuinely difficult. Medical debt, the cascading effects of a business failure, the specific trap of being a certain age and having built your identity entirely in something that was now gone. Selene read it twice. Thought about wet sneakers on a marble floor. Thought about the small, mean laugh. Thought about what she had decided a long time ago about what kind of person she was going to be when the world treated her badly. And understood that the decision applied here too in the most uncomfortable possible way. She approved it, with a note in the file that said only, "Approved, not forgiveness." Forward. The night after she signed it, she sat in the garden of the estate with Lucien and told him what she'd done. He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. "Because if I let cruelty define the rest of her life, I'm still letting that day define me." She looked at the wildflowers along the far wall. "I'm done being defined by that day." He was quiet. Then, "Okay, just okay." Which was the most Lucien response possible, and which was also, in its brevity, the most complete understanding he could offer. Their daughter was born in October. She had Lucien's dark eyes and Celine's stubborn jaw, and an opinion about everything that was audible from the moment she arrived in the world. They named her after no one in particular, just a name they both liked, that didn't carry the weight of legacy or debt or history. Just hers. 5 years after the boutique on Kellerman Avenue. 5 years after wet sneakers on a marble floor and a security guard's hand on her arm, and the sound of a small, mean laugh, and a man's convoy on a city street, and the air itself changing when he walked through the door. Selene stood in the garden in the evening light and watched her daughter run through the wildflowers along the far wall, chasing something that may have been a butterfly or may have been purely imaginary. Children at that age chase both with the same focused delight, making no distinction between what is real and what is worth running toward. Lucien came to stand beside her, put his arm around her waist, said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The Empire still existed. Enemies still spoke his name carefully. Danger still circled the edges of their world with the patient persistence of things that never fully went away. But Selene had learned, at the cost of everything it took to learn it, that the question was never whether the darkness was present. It was always whether you brought anything to put alongside it. She had. She watched her daughter stop at the far wall and reach for one of the wildflowers, the ones that had no reason to be there, that had come back anyway year after year without being planted, that bloomed in ground that wasn't designed for them because that was simply what they did. The child pulled the flower loose and turned and ran back across the garden with it held up above her head, laughing, her dark eyes bright in the golden light. Selene opened her arms. The girl ran into them, and the evening held them, all three of them, in the garden, in the fading light, in the ordinary, extraordinary wait of a moment that no one had guaranteed them, and all of them had paid something real to arrive at. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.